Therefore all the world glorifies you.
Good evening to everybody watching, to all of our patrons, and to all of our viewers. Today we are going to be... Well, welcome, Father Jeffrey. How's your evening so far?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're here
I was
too.
wondering if I was going to get a good evening.
It's not just the Father Yuri show here.
No.
Yes, good evening, Father Jeffrey. Today we're going to be talking about worshiping demons. I realize the title can be a little misleading.
Step-by-step guide.
A step-by-step guide. Worshiping demons with Dr. Daniel Opperwall and Dr. Greg Wiebe. No, we're not going to be actively worshiping demons or trying to get you to worship demons. In fact, we'll be trying to get you to do the opposite of that. And but before we bring on our guests, I just want to give a little intro to them. We've actually had Dr. Daniel Opperwall on the show before. We were talking about abusing the fathers. If you want to watch or listen to that, you can go and do that on YouTube or on our podcast. And yeah, Dr. Dan Opperwall, he's an author. He was one of my teachers along with you, Father Jeffrey, at the University of Toronto. He taught me about some of the church fathers, and we did some church history courses together, as well as a New Testament course. And he's a friend. And also, we're bringing on with him another one of my friends, Dr. Greg Wiebe, who lives in Winnipeg and who's just come out with a book entitled Fallen Angels in the Theology of St. Augustine. So they have just started a podcast called Men Among Demons, where they dive into a lot of this stuff about demons and the structures in our world and how that all works and how we as Orthodox Christians can best live a Christ-centered life. And we thought we'd bring them on. So Father Jeffrey, and to all our listeners, please welcome Dr. Daniel Opperwall and Dr. Greg Wiebe. Welcome.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, it is my pleasure, for sure. So maybe the good place to start would be the podcast, because you recently released the first episode, and now I think 3 are published for your show Men Among Demons, which is quite a catchy title. So can you give the elevator pitch before we even get started?
Yeah, well, our sort of slogan for the show is, in a disoriented world, this is the podcast that asks what would happen if we truly put Christ at the center of our thinking. In terms of an elevator pitch, I think what we're basically trying to do is look out into the world, some of the social, political trends we see going on around us, and basically ask the question of what they really look like from an Orthodox point of view, and by trying to think very, very deeply about them, to go to the roots of some of the things that are happening in our world, think about where it's all coming from, think about what would happen if we thought about Christ instead, and doing that very much and very often through the lens of Greg's work, which I'll let him talk about in a second here, but is on demons, but perhaps not in the way you might immediately think, not little men with horns, but maybe you want to jump in from there, Greg, and talk a little for a moment about what demons are and what they aren't.
Yeah, I mean, there'd be a lot of overlap between this discussion and if we get around to talking about my book. But I mean, the thing that was most striking to me is how sort of socially and politically mediated demons are in the Church Fathers, I think, generally, but St. Augustine, specifically, whom I concentrated on. The idea is that it's the demons are the gods of the nations, right? The gods of the nations are demons. And but you have to remember that for ancient Christians to talk about gods, especially before the 5th century, you're talking about like things that have statues, things that have temples and cultic rituals, and are have libations poured out to them and have games honored after them and so forth, right? You're talking about real socio-political and cultural types of things. And so I really, one risks a bit with a podcast like Men Among Demons. Like, part of the subtext is that what we're really interested in, what's really going on, right? What's actually happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it could easily tilt towards a kind of conspiracy theory, kind of genre. Like, we know what's really
it doesn't,
going on,
though.
Well, the
right?
demons are the puppet masters.
So we have to be a little bit careful, but the whole, the big impetus is that, actually underlying all these things that we interact with from day to day are patterns of significance and meaning that are trying to draw you one way or another, actually.
Yeah.
You actually find that. And so trying to explore that, not just in the ancient world, but in our world today.
When those patterns, those deep, deep patterns, are drawing us away from God, drawing us away from Christ, they are demonic. That's what the demonic is. And conversely, when they draw us toward Him, they are angelic. And so we're looking to try to explore together what those patterns look like and where they're showing up, and how we can better understand them, be more aware of them, and therefore continue putting Christ at the center of our lives and not veer away as we Christians are trying not to do.
Just to remind our viewers and listeners, if you do have a question, you are allowed to type it into the chat. If you have any questions for Dan or Greg or Father Jeffrey or even me, you're allowed to type them in. Anything to do with demons. I want to start here, and we can take the conversation where it goes. But when I think demons, like the first place that my mind goes is something like the Satanic Panic in the 80s, maybe like pentagrams in the basement, Satanism, kind of like anti-liturgies, statues of winged, horned goats or whatever it might be.
Statues of
Baphomet. So that's sort of the first place my mind goes. Then my mind goes to maybe like a totally dematerialized, like they're just thoughts, or like, well, something bad happened to me. Oh, the demon is trying to here. I'll give you an example. We do matins here at St. Maria's over Zoom a couple of times a week. And one time, one of our regular attendees was reading the 6 Psalms, and for some reason, the Amazon Alexa in the back of her, like in her living room, went, now playing Sesame Street, and it like started playing Sesame Street because it thought it heard her say something. And so we jokingly say, well, that was the demons trying to distract us from prayer. But that seems kind of quaint to me. Like that doesn't, I don't know, is that right? So those are the two places where my mind goes, sort of like a boogeyman, a way of just explaining bad things that happen. But then the other side is maybe this groups of people who get together and actually do these kind of anti-liturgy kind of things. So maybe that's a good place to start, and whoever wants to go first, and then whoever else wants to react from that is welcome to do so.
Yeah. Right. And again, there's a lot of sort of overlap in the story of writing my book, but like that's the tension, right? Because in the literature, and certainly what we're now going after in the podcast, is exactly that. Those things seem seem a little too exotic and a little too easy, right? It's a little too easy, and I think you're not wrong to point to those things. I think those are part of the story. But what I'm really interested in, and I think what we're trying to explore in the podcast, is how those sort of more fantastical or obvious references to demons are part of a deeper pattern that's far more mundane, right? It's far more everyday life. That's what I think. That's how I think about it.
I think what you're saying, Father Yuri, is the occult can be demonic. I mean, typically is. It's kind of hard to imagine it vectoring one towards Christ if you're worshiping a statue of Baphomet. So it's not like that isn't demonic. It's just that there's a lot more. That's not the only place you locate at that. I also think it's important to note, especially within Orthodox context, that we're also not. This is almost a little hard to describe and unpack, but we're not trying to, totally, domesticate the concept of the demons either. I think for St. Augustine, certainly for me, there is something to the notion of these kinds of active intelligences that are have either bodies that are so minimal as to be, intangible, or maybe no bodies at all. There's a lot of speculation in the fathers about which is which, but certainly in the authors I work with, and certainly in my own life experience, intrusive thoughts and other sorts of things that happen in the mind that seem to come externally. These are real phenomena as well. So it's not quite, we're also not quite going down the road of saying, well, see, demons are just merely metaphors for something that's going on politically in the world. But it's a big, broad, interconnected way of framing what's going on around us that goes all the way from these stereotypical things you're talking about up into seeing what's going on with whatever Facebook, or whatever it is that's happening in our culture.
Like the stereotypical events to me are the fringe on the garment, right? Like there's, they're an important part. And it's almost like a little, those kinds of events I would tend to see surely not as made up. I mean, it's conceivable that people can make up these stories, of course, and it's not just sort of a blanket credulity with all these stories. I don't think that's appropriate, but sometimes things happen. And that's important to recognize, but really to see them as part of a broader pattern, right? They're almost these little flourishes at the edge when things are, when things are happening and felt particularly acutely, right? In particularly intensive moments and things like that. But that not to concentrate on that, those are almost peripheral to the larger story. In the kind of way that like demons show up in the Bible with Christ, very like in a very special way. Like it's really acute, right? He has these very dramatic and acute encounters with these invisible forces that are these dramatic stories of confrontation and exorcism and so forth. But in the broader Christian tradition, it's like it's the gods of the nations. It's this pattern of the demons are to be equated with the foreign gods. And so it's like, well, how do you fit that together? And I find it more fruitful to think of it exactly as I'm suggesting, which is like, what is the fundamental pattern that helps you make sense of what's going on in these like more intense moments that you see, most prototypically, archetypally in the life of Christ, but it happens in the lives of Christians and so forth, right? So to try, step back from the exoticism and the extreme drama of these situations, and like, what's the underlying pattern? What are the, how do these things manifest more mundanely? That's what I've been interested in.
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying things are a lot more, like you just said, things are a lot more mundane. Like,
that's the good news and the bad news. I mean, if only it were just the occult and Baphomet, which is not demonic. I think sometimes there's
just don't listen
tendency
to metal
among,
music.
yeah, like there can be tendencies among even Orthodox and certainly a lot of Christians to sort of say that's the space where that is, and if we're avoiding that, we're okay.
Yeah,
I think Greg's take, or our take, and the show together is more daunting in a lot of ways, because it's kind of it's all struck all through our lives.
I remember Father Jeffrey talking with you on our episode on exorcism. So we did a season on the service of baptism, and one of the things that happens when you receive a catechumen, or sometimes that's attached right to the service of baptism, is you perform exorcisms, right? And Father Jeffrey, the way that you sort of framed it was exactly sort of this, not normalizing, but just sort of I'm finding finding it hard to find the right word, but like it's trying to avoid that sort of Hollywood exorcist head spinning idea of exorcism, and just this is something that we do all the time, and it's kind of a normal thing.
In the scholarship, they'd call it demythologization, right? You're sort of demythologizing demons. Although I don't actually quite like that way of putting it.
I was about to say it earlier too, and I didn't like it either. That's a whole can of worms, I think.
The problem here may be one of vocabulary, though, because we've come across this problem often in our podcast. We've talked about different things. I mean, in English, we tend sometimes just to transliterate Greek words and adopt them, right? And we can sometimes err in our understanding because we kind of make of something a very specific religious category of something which it never had in the original Greek. You know, a case in point is baptism, right? You know, people would baptize their bread, baptize all kinds of things because it just means to immerse or dip. And I think the problem of just taking the word demon today, obviously, is it's always and everywhere in people's minds going to have a post-Hollywood, you know, post-horror or occult, you know, connection. And I take, you know, what Dan's saying there, that obviously there may be some connection, you know, with occult and so forth. But to go back to its original meaning of just a spirit, right? You know, Socrates spoke about, you know, his daemonion being what inspired him, his muse nearly, right? And you can even have good spirits. In fact, the very word used in Aristotle for happiness means a good demon, right? Ev daemonion. And so if we broaden, you know, without, you know, demythologizing, but broaden the kind of construct here of, and I think this actually has a lot of resonance in our, you know, kind of way of thinking. We talk about, for example, the spirit of the age, right? Which would be very much, you know, that prevailing, you know, muse or guiding force or ultimate value or what have you, that would kind of dominate, you know, whole age, or a particular nation can have, you know, a kind of spirit that overtakes it, you know. And I know that there's, you know, breaking all kinds of rules by mentioning Nazi Germany, you know, it always comes up, but there's a sense in which, I mean, Thomas Mann spoke about this, that it wasn't even just a demonic possession of individuals, but the whole nation at the time was possessed, you know, by a spirit. And that spirit can be, you know, as Dan says, an arc towards or away from Christ. And I think thinking of it in those terms as a kind of governing spirit, right, it can maybe be helpful to kind of move away from those particular manifestations, which may be, you know, in stories, in narratives, in art, literature, in statuary or what have you, you know, which take on various forms, but to understand it not, you know, demythologizing away from there to kind of make it some sort of abstract psychological construct, but a genuine spirit that either motivates towards, you know, a good end or towards a bad end. And so we can speak of good and bad spirits, and I think that is maybe a more helpful vocabulary for us. And I mean, not trying to change the title of your podcast by any means, but the word demon, I think,
we
is
wanted it to be a little,
you know,
little bit grabby anyway. You know,
it's provocative, but I think one of the things, you know, if our listeners may be benefit from is just sort of thinking, rather than just transliterating this word, which has all this complexity and nuance and so forth. I mean, even that phrase from the Psalms in the Septuagint that, you know, Greg's quoted a couple times already, that the gods of the nations are, you know, daemonia. It doesn't mean they're horned, you know, creatures or even, you know, necessarily, you know, evil. It just means that they are, in fact, little. You know, the Hebrew that the Septuagint is translating, the word there, you know, just kind of means little gods, little, you know, minor, almost petty. You don't have to
like
say,
little
you know,
nothings, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's kind of they don't have the worth of the true God, of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so, but it doesn't actually make the same kind of value judgment in terms of, you know, wicked, evil, occult, you know, filled with all kinds of, you know, nefarious, you know, reality. And I think that's where this point about making it a little bit more mundane, and therefore scarier, to know that it doesn't have to have that quality to be precisely the thing that is lesser and, you know, therefore, you know, idolatrous than worshiping, you know, the true God of Israel, who is the only, you know, source of our being and the only object of our desire if we are properly faithful, right? So anything less than that true worship. And in Israel itself, you know, was for long periods of time not monotheistic in the sense of saying there is only one God and, you know, we've got him, but they were monolatrous, right? They're worshiping singly the God of Israel, knowing that you could make and give power to by your worship any number of things, from, idols in a temple on the corner to money or sex or power or whatever. Every time we invest these things with our worship, we give them power, and we create the possibility of what we call the demonic, or this kind of these spirits that tend away from the true worship of God. And I think, your podcast theme is brilliant in the sense that, we all need to be reminded over and over again, we are worshiping beings at the core, right? We are always and everywhere worshiping something. And if that's not the God of Israel, the true God, who commands the entirety of our worship, then we are precisely the idolaters of which, the scriptures, speak and condemn, because it's anything less than that is precisely demonic, or following these lesser spirits, these worthless gods.
Exactly.
Greg or Dan, if you want to respond, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think in terms of in using the term, like in the literature, you'll find that lots of people sort of deal with this problem, the baggage of the term demons, by actually, because we don't, what we have in English, demons, demons, is an anglicization of the Latin term, which is a transliteration of a Greek term. And what scholars these days will do to emphasize that there's a difference between what we mean today by demons and what the ancients meant, by simply transliterating the Greek. And so it'll be DAIMON in their text and italicized, right? But I decided very early on not to do that. And to actually just use the term as we use it, because there is a polemic, and I want to sustain the polemic. It's a polemic for our time, right? That people are misunderstanding what demons are, and so I want to use that term exactly in order to rehabilitate it and say, you think that demons are all these spooky boogeymen with horns and so forth and whatever, but really, like, there's something deeper to be paying attention to. And so I made a conscious choice to continue to use that term, knowing that there's this kind of risk, right? There's this kind of risk of people from my church gave me the feedback. The name's pretty intense. The name of the podcast is really intense. So we're flirting with that, flirting with that possibility of giving, giving the wrong impression, so to speak. But it is, there is something, to me, there's something to it. And I think that there's a couple of ways to go about it. Although, one of the things you want to do exactly is remember that, what we're talking about is spirits, right? Like to see not, because I'm not a fan of technical terms, right? Like I don't like relying on individual words to carry a lot of baggage for me. I want to see overlapping patterns, how the overlapping patterns work, what demons, fallen angels, spirits, evil spirits, unclean spirits, which is a lot of the language of the New Testament and so forth. So yeah, like I think there's a lot going on there. I think there's a lot to be said. But the fundamental point about seeing these things in terms of an orientation in the world of worshiping the one true God is absolutely the core Christian message.
So in the ancient world, like I forget who was mentioning it, right? Probably you, Greg, right at the beginning of the live stream, that there's the first handful of centuries, Christians lived in a world in which pagan temples existed around the corner, and there was worship to statues that were there. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of a regular part of the culture. And, Father Jeffrey and I did our series on baptism and kind of some of the stuff that informs the turning around and spitting on the devil and raising your hands and then turning around and bowing and uniting yourself with Christ. You could very well have seen, the proverbial temple down the street as you're denouncing the devil, facing towards the outside of the church or the community. And I think in our imagination as Orthodox Christians today, we can understand that, okay, those things were demons. But nowadays, if you look out over the street, you're not going to see like a temple to Zeus or things like that. Even
but you are.
well, talk
Oh,
a little
but
bit
you
about
are.
that.
Well, because I think, and this is to Greg's point and Father Jeffrey's point too, and to the whole thesis of what's going on here, is that one thing you have to remember about the ancient Roman mindset is that in many ways it's very, very similar to ours, and in a lot of ways we live in a society that looks a lot like ancient Rome. In some other ways we really don't. And one of the really key things is that secularism does not exist in the first century Rome, second, third, whatever. The notion that there is a line between the worship at the temple and what's happening in politics or society is a modern thing. These people don't see it that way. To them, politics, whether things go well with the empire, whether things go well politically, whether things go well for a given ruler, this is entirely and always wrapped up with doing proper worship and properly pleasing the gods. And the whole problem with Christians is they aren't participating in that. So they become easy scapegoats when things aren't going well. You know, maybe if they had offered their sacrifices, the gods would be pleased and we wouldn't be in this mess. It's hard, I think, for moderns to even enter into it, that mindset that there's no line there at all. And so with respect to whether there's a temple of Zeus across this street from me, like in some ways, no, but in a lot of ways, absolutely yes, because what Romans are doing is personifying certain kinds of forces that are both natural as well as social, political. Romans were really into gods too, by the way. I mean, they had gods for absolutely everything, you know, the lintel on your door and every little item in the house. And you had household gods, you had personal family gods that were actually typically much more important in worship than the big political ones that are kind of the gods of the state. You know, you have gods in your home, in your house, you have gods of the state, and that's where you get your Zeus. That's where you get later the emperors become gods. This is why that's possible, right? You know, Caesar is a god because he's the founder of the new system. Augustus is a god. You have to worship him. So these things are all 100% intertwined. So in a lot of the most important ways, we absolutely have temples to the things that we worship in our society. We just don't quite go as far as to sort of personify that and make a statue of its personification. Sometimes we even almost get there. But yeah, it's like it's there. And I think this is kind of what we're looking to unpack on the show, what Greg's unpacking to some degree in his work, unless I've read you wrong there, Greg. But minus that personifying, mythologizing tendency, we're doing very, very, very similar things, I think.
Well, Dan, you and I were just in Edmonton on the weekend.
We sure were.
Together. It was nice
together
to see
for the first time in years.
I know. Unbelievable. And we went to a hockey game.
We did.
whatever the place is that the Edmonton Oilers play in is called. Rexall Place? Is it still called that? Anyways.
Craig, I don't know.
It's a I don't know. It's a new arena, right? And you walk around the corner and it's like a spaceship. It's like you've walked out onto a spaceship.
It's incredible.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And we got in there and you work your way up and you go up like a couple of flights of stairs. And you sort of go and you turn around a corner and all of a sudden it's this huge, expansive, open space filled with Oilers fans. And there's like music going and there's this like intense energy, right? Like you remember that feeling and what what did I say exactly when we turned around that corner? Like, it's like a temple, man. It's like a temple.
It is, and in the ancient Roman world, these facilities are temples. You know, the sports is huge for them as well, and in part for the exact same reasons it is for us. It's exciting, it's fun. I don't think sports is inherently evil. I'm a huge baseball fan. I know Father Yuri's crushed by the loss of the Ticats. I was too.
Too soon.
Go Blue Bombers! Hello.
Sorry, we got. Oh, right, we're split up here. Ugh.
Yeah, I've just removed Greg from the live stream.
And this is exactly to my point, is that these are still temples in very, very similar ways. The one difference is, there may be many differences, but one of the differences is that in an ancient Roman world, you try to capture that spirit and you give it a name and you make a statue of it, and that's what a god is.
Mhm.
So we don't do that part very often anymore. Occasionally we still do, and we were doing this, in our secular politics into the 19th, even 20th century, especially in the United States. You see a lot of, justice is personified, and these sorts of things are personified. Basically the same move. So that's missing when we went to the Oilers game. Everything else, like we are worshiping not just the Oilers, but we're worshiping fun, consumerism. We've got Ford Motor Company everywhere, and I think we're probably a lot closer than we are distant in that respect. It's a good example, Greg. I feel like I kind of cut you off there, but
No. That's exactly what I was looking for. Yeah, and I mean, I think you will wind up seeing it. Like people are still capable of a certain divine fervor in our own day and age, and we know, we talk about cancel culture and this and that. Like, we know that humans still have the capacity to try to force others to make a sacrifice of themselves on behalf of an idea. Do you know what I mean? Like you want, like, there are kinds of conflicts that you see in social media, and you want people to get fired from their jobs and whatever it is, in order to not displease the gods. I mean, I think this way of thinking about it is really a robust way to understand why people are capable of doing some of these things. That's because we always have. They're actually really human things to do, right? You perceive a landscape, and there's certain problems, and that can only be addressed if you make the right kinds of sacrifices. And you're always trying to manifest ideals and have peace between heaven and earth, right? You're trying to as long as we maintain peace with the gods, then we will have happiness, right? Whether it's the right mix of races and genders and whatever in your social organization, or making sure someone who said the wrong thing gets fired from their job, right? You're always like, there's this underlying, we don't talk about it this way anymore, but like, it sure has this feeling of, we got to make sure we make the right sacrifices and make the right reparations and expiations in order to maintain peace with the gods.
I'm going to try and sum up the past 10, 15 minutes, but Father Jeffrey, I want to give you an opportunity if you want to hop in there with anything you can.
No, why don't you sum up first, and then we can move on.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, Greg, and maybe we'll start with what you just said, it's almost as if in our culture, and this is true of all cultures, there's certain principles or certain ideals that we have as a society, right? It might be justice, or it might be kind of whatever. And that we as human beings, when we gather in community, tend to have this behavior of trying to make sure that people align according to these ideals, and that let's say in times of like ancient Rome or whatever, which is the example we keep coming back to, what would happen in that culture is that kind of ideal of justice or whatever it might be is then not only left in the sort of conceptual sphere, but is actually built into a statue that's put into a building, which serves as a locus of focus in honor of that thing. And what I'm hearing you say, Dan and Greg, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we still have that exact same cultural behavior as humans. We still have these different ideals, and we still treat them as something that needs to be appeased in particular ways. The one thing that we're lacking perhaps is the personification of that ideal into like a statue or things like that.
We're less keen on that. We still have mascots though. We still do it, but yeah, I think that's a decent summary. And I think and Father Jeffrey made this point earlier, and it came up in one of the episodes on Men Among Demons as well, is that you cannot but do that. You cannot not worship. It's not possible. You will worship. You're a human. You will worship. So it's a question of how you're going to arrange and organize your worship and what you're going to worship.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, like part of the thing I think it's important to remember, like to think back when Father Jeffrey, you were talking about, he brought up the Nazis, made the great error, but talking about the spirit of the age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the thing is that if everywhere has those spirits, the zeitgeist, the signs of the times, the spirit of the times, and it also happens at every level, right? Like it's not just the nation, it's also like my university, the place where I work, it's sports fans and when they gather together at the arena, it's even small groups of friends and so forth, right? Like that, it's this just happens. Like I think about certain meetings at work, at a university, where you're making decisions about certain policies. This happened a couple times this fall. You're making certain decisions about policies, and you just have this sense like this whole thing is going to happen, and it does not matter what I say. If I don't like it, it doesn't matter, right? And it's because everyone's just on the same page, right? Like there are places have their spirits, they have their principalities.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a thesis of mine that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like one of the interesting things is that making a statue to that spirit and developing cultic rituals and mythology around it is kind of a conservative move, right? Like to make a statue of something and stick it right in the middle of things helps you keep it around, helps you maintain that spirit. And not having those things, sure feels like it makes everything a lot more flowy. Like there's just constant change, constant shifting. It's very difficult to pin down. But anyways, that I've been thinking about that lately, but I don't. It's underdeveloped, half-baked.
I think the other thing that's really important in this discussion is the extent to which most of this is completely uninterrogated. The worship of the human being takes place at the level of desire, of the heart, not in the intellect principally. I mean, the intellect can reflect on it and can from time to time host a live stream podcast in the evening and talk about it and discuss it and unpack it a little bit. But as social psychologists will tell you, I mean, 95% of what we do as human beings is habitual. It's embedded in our bodies. It's the ritual, cultic, liturgical things that we do with our lives just on an ongoing basis that we never even think about, right? And so we don't even notice when it is worship and when it is, putting ultimate value into something. This whole discussion of the Edmonton Oilers and the, going to a kind of sports event like that. And there's some obviously liturgical elements of that. We can point at that and we can use that as an example. But what about going to the shopping center and all of the ritual around that, about, entering into the sacred space, which is carefully crafted to guide you on a kind of spiritual journey of encounter and of ultimate value, ultimate meaning. There's transactions and libations that are made there. There's exemplars. There's a whole traditioning of story that you enter into. And most of us do that and participate in that without ever interrogating it at all. We sort of think, well, we're Christians, and the story that I belong to is the story of God. I read the Bible. I participate in liturgy on Sundays for about an hour and a half, but the rest of my life, I'm participating in these completely uninterrogated cultural liturgies and rituals, which have stories themselves, which I've never even really articulated as stories. That just are, they're part of the daily life that has become the habitus of my life. And I go about them. And then the key thing is, well, then at the end of the day, and there will be an end of the day, when what's in our hearts will be unfolded and opened up. If there's anything that the final judgment will be about, is sort of saying, that 95% that you never even looked at in your life, what was its ultimate value, right? There's this marvelous film by the Russian filmmaker Tarkovsky called Stalker, which has a horrible name in English. It doesn't really mean that. It's more like Guide, right? But it's a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape and world in which there's nothing left, right? But people are trying to get to this place called The Room. And the room is this kind of oasis amidst the apocalypse in which the ultimate desire of your heart will be fulfilled. You'll get the ultimate desire of your heart, right? So Stalker, this guide, takes these various characters as a professor, there's all these different people. But when they finally get there, and there's all about the journey of getting there, but when they finally get there, they hesitate because they sort of realize, hang on a minute, do I actually know what the ultimate desire of my heart is? You know, because living up here with the 5%, I identify as this. One guy is going, he thinks the ultimate desire of his heart would be to save his brother, right, who's dying of some horrible disease or something. But it turns out the ultimate desire of his heart was to be fabulously wealthy. Right.
Yeah.
And that's how he actually lived his life. That's how he actually oriented the habits and pattern of his life and so forth. So how many of us who fashion and fancy ourselves as Christians because we have the card, right? And we participate in the right thing. Maybe if you looked at our libraries, the right books are there or whatever. We've done the right schools and gone to the right courses. We talk a good game. But the 95% of us that is properly embedded and embodied in all kinds of other stories and rituals and cultural liturgies and worship. I mean, what is that all about? And you know, to that famous joke of, you know, if I were actually tried to as being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict me, right? You know, and that's not just about ideas or thoughts, but about the totality of our lives somehow. And I think that's where this becomes a really chastening kind of discussion.
That's exactly right. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Because the thing is, when we became Christians and entered the church, we renounced Satan and all his angels and all his pomps and processions. What were we renouncing? Like, that's what the podcast is about, right? It's like, how do you understand?
And did we really do it?
No, because we went home from that and we continued to live in just the same way.
I think I watched
we always did.
Yeah, exactly.
A Lions game, which is worse.
Right, like, and that's what the podcast is about. It's like, what,
exactly.
is to figure out how do these things get embodied? We renounce these things, but where are they?
And I think it's key with Father saying what you're saying, Greg, that like our angle is not that it's all them or something, like it's all this evil world and we, you know, innocent, perfect Orthodox Christians are just trying to protect ourselves. We are participating in it all the time. I'm participating in it all the time. And to some degree, it is the world out there. Like within the church, there is a difference. It's not that there's no difference either. We are trying to not, but it's a very complicated soup that we're all part of. So it's not an us them thing that we're interested in doing. But sorry, Father, you wanted to.
Well, Sharon sent in a question. Do we personify them in movie characters or particular personalities, resulting in personality cults?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Cult of celebrity is huge.
Important question to which the answer may simply be yes. Which is not to dismiss the question.
No. And I think that question came at the time, if I'm hearing Sharon correctly, because I was mentioning we have these ideals, and then in cultures past, you'd personify them in statues. I think maybe I'm not sure, Sharon. You can message back here if I'm characterizing you wrong, but it's like, are we providing an image for the god through cinema or through like these personality
our celebrities, the new statues.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's exactly that. Like, that's the right, to me, that's the right way to think about these things, right?
You go to the temple of the shopping center and there's statuary everywhere, right? So
icons
they're not just, you know, kind of audio visual format, digital format. I mean, we put these things up precisely in the same sense that they were put up in ancient temples to draw people into that transactional space, to make the sacrifice, you even take away some sort of token of that religious experience that you can maybe at home continue to experience what you received on pilgrimage to that temple, right? I mean, it all you have to do is shift the things a very little bit and you can see the same human behavior.
I mean, not to pick on the Oilers too much, but it's like you go in there and there's a 50-foot tall image of Connor McDavid. It's like, just imagine that being you. But it's the same thing, right? And in the mall, there's the half-naked women and all this. Like, it's all there. They're all
Yep.
all icons to
Mm.
a different kind of cult images.
Mhm.
Well, things are heating up in the discussion, so no pun intended with men among demons. But we will take a break right now, and in 15 minutes we will be starting up again on Patreon for our patrons. So if you are not a patron, you can always go to patreon.com/enactingthekingdom and pick a tier of support, and you'll get access to the I guess I should leave that up there. You'll get access to the second half of this interview/discussion, as well as everything else me and Father Jeffrey have up there. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much, Greg and Dan and Father Jeffrey. And we'll see everybody over on Patreon in 15 minutes.
Thanks for having us.
Mhm.